Oh, okay. If you could come back, we're ready to start. Okay, welcome back. Thank you very much. My name is Mike Hager. I'm a reporter with the BC Bureau in Vancouver. And, many years ago, I started covering one-off hate incidences that were, really devastating to communities in BC. And eventually you start wondering, how are these crimes being tackled by police? And you asked your local force to interview the head of the hate crimes unit and get a flat denial. You get that denial for an interview request enough times, and then you start wondering, well, what are they, what do they not want to unpack? So as a journalist, you begin to, think about the systems in place, and a colleague, Ian Bailey, who hosted a previous panel, talked about our investigation just into how often suspects are charged in these cases, which is, perhaps the best metric for justice for people who are impacted by these crimes. And turns out even the best, most successful forces were charging someone in less than a third of cases over nearly a decade. So there's definitely big gaps in a lot of places, and part of those gaps exist further along in the criminal justice process with prosecution and in court trials. So here we have a great panel today. To my left, in person, is Reverend Dr. Anthony Bailey. He's the coordinating minister of Parkdale United Church in Ottawa. Thank you for being here, Anthony. And then live, on live stream, we have Kanika Samuels-Wortley, who's also a doctor and assistant professor with the Institute of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Carleton University. Thanks for dialing in, Kanika. And unfortunately, Dr. Erwin Kotler sends his regrets. He's unable to attend today. He's really sorry. He's dealing with an illness, and so we just have us three, which is great. So let's get started. Okay, so Kanika, I'd like to begin just kind of asking you to explain your research into police forces and how they tackle hate crimes. And, when we spoke earlier, you mentioned how, like the public, a lot of frontline officers are grappling with, the definition of hate crime in Canada. As we've heard earlier, that is a huge impediment to even just kind of understanding the scope and scale of the problem in Canada. So can you just tell me kind of what officers and what your research has shown in terms of their clarity on the current legislation?
Certainly. So just to confirm, my research centers the experiences of vulnerable communities with police, and also how police engage with vulnerable communities. So when it comes to hate crime in particular, what is an issue with the current legislation is that it allows for officer discretion and differing interpretations, which then can lead to inconsistencies in how hate crime is dealt with. And as was discussed in the previous panel, this could be a reflection of training. And this can then impact officer levels of understanding of what is a hate crime. As was noted, every service has a different form of training. There isn't a unified national guidelines on what constitutes as a hate crime and what can be the mechanisms used to address hate crime. And in the research that I've done with my colleague, Dr. Perry, in relation to some police officers, they might not even constitute experiences with a hate crime as a crime that necessitates further enhancement. It's just perceived as any other crime in the criminal code. And there's issues with that because that mitigates the experiences and the traumas that those who are marginalized and vulnerable in their what experiencing a hate crime can have. And also there is sometimes inconsistencies in how officers believe they can actually address experiences with hate crime, or victims who say that they've experienced hate crime. And without this knowledge, and with these inconsistencies, it doesn't exactly create a high level of trust that the police are going to be the ones to handle or deal with the traumas and negative experiences of experiencing a hate crime. And as a result, there are continued tensions between those who experience that hate, and also tensions with how police officers themselves can address and deal with acts that are perceived to be as a result of hate.
Thanks for that. And unfortunately, Anthony, I mean, you have firsthand experience. I was hoping you could maybe unpack just what happened to your church yourself, and then the process that you kind of chose to kind of go through that perhaps is much different than typically what happens when a hate crime occurs. So maybe you can kind of explain to the audience first what happened, and then this unique path that you chose out.
Yeah, thank you very much. In 2016, in the fall of 2016, our church was attacked with racist graffiti sprayed on our building, and also threats towards me, violence, and so forth. This was the second time that this took place. And of course, it was very traumatizing for our community and for our congregants. Some of our young racialized Black students in the congregation felt threatened, in a sense, because they would often see the church as a safe space and so forth, and feel like they experience when they go to school or other places various kinds of trauma and discrimination. In the church, they feel safe and so forth. So that was something that we had to deal with. But what was significant in terms of understanding not only our Christian values and the ways in which we thought to there's a term in our Jewish brothers and sisters, tikkun olam, which is to kind of heal the world, and part of our own commitment is to restorative justice. So the perpetrator who did this was just shy of age of majority.
And it was a spree, right? He targeted a number of institutions.
That's right. Yeah, he targeted our church with racist Black graffiti, synagogue, mosque, and so forth. And so we decided after he was apprehended, I asked for an opportunity to go and see him, to speak with him in detention. And that was a very challenging conversation. But I felt it was important for me to look him in the eye, and he looked me in the eye, to see the humanity behind the person he was seeking to harm, and the community seeking to harm. Long story short, we decided to partner with Collaborative Justice Project at the Ottawa Court, and said, we want an opportunity to journey with this young man. We're not going to give up on him. We understand that he's been steeped in racist tropes and anti-Jewish and anti-Muslim and that sort of thing. So we decided that we are going to embark on a restorative justice journey with this person. And we did that. We did that for 3 years. For 3 years, we used an intermediary, Collaborative Justice, and so we would send communications back and forth. He had to write certain essays on a Jewish personality, a Black person, and so forth, to really understand what are the realities and so forth. But so there was this, we had a small group from our church, the intermediaries, the Collaborative Justice Project, and this young man. We would send messages back and forth. And over those 3 years, we got to understand a little bit about him. We decided that we want to give him the best possibility to succeed in life. And so he was on parole, and he was looking to find work. We bought him the equipment that he needed to do the work and so forth. And after 3 years, he had renounced his anti-Black and racist views and anti-Jewish views and so forth, and realized that there was a lot more that he did not know and would turn. So it was an incredible story. Something that we felt is part of the extension of our Christian commitment to be restorative and so forth. And so we were pleased with that. But it does cost those who are seeking to do that, it does cost, because it was traumatizing. It was traumatizing for me. The second time that was directed at me, they never caught the first person who did this. But most people would not know my own story. But actually, I used to live in Montreal. My brother and I were attacked by racists who didn't like black people, and they killed my brother, stabbed him in the heart, and died in my arms. So this reality was something that we understand needs to be interrupted, because vengeance and retributive justice doesn't carry us anywhere, doesn't get us anywhere. And so it's a commitment that has been made in terms of our own theology and our own practice, is to see what kind of restorative remedies are possible, where possible. It's not always that. The other thing that we've been doing more recently, that I've been doing, is working with the prosecutor at the Ottawa Courthouse for those that are deemed rehabilitative. So I've had an opportunity to speak with those who have done, racist events, but feel like they are disposed to learning and to growing. And so I've been involved with.
And these are typically younger suspects, obviously. StatsCan doesn't have much data, but they show that suspects that have been caught skew younger and white men typically.
Yes. Both. The most recent ones have been white, a female and a male, and having a Zoom opportunity to do some education and reflection and so forth. And then the prosecutor determines whether there is this genuine remorse. And some very positive things have come from that, because there's been a rapprochement from the one who's been victimized, and they've kind of come to an understanding. So it's very satisfying. It doesn't happen all the time. This is not a situation that is amenable to everyone, because there's some that are so hardened. But where the possibility is there, we seek to try to engage and to have a rehabilitative initiative.
And I mean, you noted how rare this is. It's really nice to have a hopeful kind of approach like this, but it is quite rare, and it does need that buy-in from the Crown. Kanika, do you see that kind of relationship there between police and Crown?
That's a great question, and that actually is at times noted as an issue. The idea of for police officers to have that ability to move forth with a hate crime, officers often speak to that there's a high threshold to proceed with a hate crime. And it is because the Crown has to approve, the Attorney General has to approve that there is enough evidence to demonstrate that the act was motivated entirely by hate. And for that reason, quite often, officers feel that they don't have the incentive to move forward with a hate crime, because quite often it doesn't move forward and is identified as a hate crime. Furthermore, there can be times if an officer hasn't developed a deep relationship or a close relationship with the Crown Attorney's Office or the Attorney General, that too can create a breakdown in what's next, what can be relayed to a victim. And this too can also have an impact on what a victim thinks is possible. Quite often victims may believe that police officers have all the power to move a charge forward. And with the threshold so high, and that it must be consented and approved by the Attorney General, it creates another barrier and another gap between to actually lead to a formal hate charge. So that certainly is been identified as an additional barrier. And that there needs to be better relationships between the police as well as the Attorney General's office, the Crown attorneys, in order for us to move forward and hopefully lead to higher clearance rates and higher charges when it comes to hate crimes, and thus victims feel that their experiences are validated.
Yeah, and that confusion is kind of central to so many issues, right? In Canada, the approval from the Attorney General is needed just for those hate propaganda offenses, but most of the hate crimes are are just other offenses motivated by hate that must be, tacked on at sentencing. We know that rarely happens. Just a handful of cases. In the Globes investigation, we unpacked what happened in 2019, given that's when the StatsCan General Social Survey came out on victimization. 130,000 people said they were victims of violent attacks motivated by hate. Some 40 some odd thousand said they reported to police, 48,000. And yet, I think based off a Department of Justice study from 2020, we found just 6 cases involved those hate propaganda offenses or sentencing being, tacked on and a stiffer penalty being given. So a lot of people are, organizing a push to change the criminal code and come up with standalone offenses, to stipulate hate-motivated assault, hate-motivated mischief. To either of you, I guess, to Anthony, would that improve your congregation or everyday people's conception of what a hate crime is and perhaps a better understanding? And then maybe Kanika, to officers on the front line, I mean, they're essentially just street-level bureaucrats. Would this help them better identify hate and investigate it?
I think so. I think it would be a discrete category that enables the police to recognize something that not is diffused and kind of lumped together, but to recognize that there's this is a particular discrete reality and crime and engagement. And I think a standalone would be helpful to be able to address it systemically, but also in a reparative way.
And sorry, Kanika, before you answer, audience questions, we have a bit more time because unfortunately Erwin can't attend, so get those in if you can. Kanika, do you have any sense of whether more standalone hate crimes offenses would help officers?
I agree with Reverend Bailey. I believe that having a standalone offense will allow officers to have a concrete way of addressing situations that are deemed as a result of hate. It also is better for the community to know that there is that opportunity, and if there is a perception that what they have experienced is hate, they can turn to. And there also will be clear guidelines that will outline whether the experiences of the victim is indeed an experience of hate. I think a standalone offense is long overdue, and certainly can validate the experiences of so many who have experienced incidents of hate, have experienced a hate crime, and simply didn't have the mechanism or the charge to turn to in order to address that experience.
Stephen Camp, who helped create Edmonton's hate crimes unit in the early 2000s, it stuck with me. He said that the code has a violation for stealing driftwood. And that's always kind of, I mean, there are these really particular offenses. When your church was hit in that spree, what did you find yourself explaining to congregants and your community in terms of what may be possible under the justice system before the restorative approach was taken?
Yeah, I mean, there was a conversation with our elders and members in the congregation about, how do we respond? And certainly it was egregious enough to call the police. The police were involved. They actually were very good in terms of trying to speak and seek to find reparation, seek to find what was necessary to do. But we were, as I mentioned, very intentional about wanting to what I would call tell a better story. It's not denying the reality of hate and reality of racism, but there's something that we did actually was to try to tell a better story, and I'll tell you what this is. So it was our church, it was the synagogue and a mosque, and we decided, the Imam Metwali and our dear friend Rabbi Bulka, now passed, bless his memory, we decided to get together and to do something helpful but subversive. And what that was, this happened in December, around Hanukkah and Christmas, and so we're just a few weeks away. We decided that what we were going to do is to bring our communities together, the mosque, the synagogue, and the church, and we were going to come en masse to do a huge blood drive. So we asked members of our congregations to come into the blood services and so forth. And, you know, media was there and people gave blood and so forth. But the message that we were saying is that when you look at blood donation, it is categorized by type, not racialized or ethnic. Type O, type B, whatever, AB. And that blood was going to be given to the hospitals. When you go to a hospital and you need blood, you don't ask the surgeon, did this blood come from a Jewish person or a black person or whatever? We were saying that fundamentally, the story we're telling is that we belong together. We have to find creative ways to demonstrate our unity, to demonstrate what's there. So it was some people might say, well, that's kind of hokey. I don't think so. I think that it is telling a better story about how we belong to each other. And there was a lot of response, you know, in terms of the community. We went to each other's places of worship, spoke in each other's places of worship, and said, this is one of the ways in which we have to bring a complex of activities and of innovative ways to speak into this reality and to say we have to undermine the root causes of hate. The police told us at the time that this happened that there were over 100 neo-Nazi and hate groups in Canada that they have surveillance over. So it's much broader than people think, but we have to understand the necessity to confront it directly, but also in innovative ways.
And thank you for that. Kanika, are there any other kind of legislative fixes that you see or solutions for police to kind of have more tools perhaps or better approach survivors in their communities?
I'm not sure if I would say that I might not be best to explain the legislative changes, but as a researcher, I think it's very important to evaluate whether changes that are being made are actually meaningful and beneficial within the community. Has it changed perceptions of the way that police are engaging in dealing with hate crime? Is it changing perceptions of engagements and the interactions between police and those who are vulnerable and experiencing hate crime? And that's going to necessitate community voice. So having a clear understanding as to whether they believe that their experiences are being validated and heard. And as such, it is important for there to be better data available to show that there are changes in the community, whether that be there is a increase in the number of charges that actually lead to an individual being reprimanded for engaging in a hate crime, but also what happens with the offender. It's also important to know what do they learn from this experience, and are they having a better understanding as to what is hate crime and the impact that has on the community. So it's going to be very important to have a clear understanding of the community and whether they believe that there have been meaningful changes based on police response as well as legislative responses as well.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. One of the things I want to mention, if I could, is the nomenclature in terms of how things are named. Mm-hmm. So for instance, you could talk about violent and nonviolent hate crimes, right? I don't think that's helpful. The reason it's not helpful is because when you talk about something being nonviolent, a hate crime being nonviolent, to whom is it nonviolent? It impacts people in a very serious, guttural and basic way. And so I think that it is a misnomer, a misrepresentation. So I know that those are categories, violent and nonviolent, but it affects the mental well-being, it affects the sense of safety in those who are impacted. So I think we have to find better terms to talk about that, because it's not nonviolent. It's violent to racialized people and disadvantaged people when they experience that. There's nothing nonviolent about that emotionally and psychologically and so forth.
Mm-hmm. And increasingly that hatred is easier to spread than ever online. Wondering whether you're sensing just that shift and in terms of that online hatred and whether police are having trouble confronting it. I know that they report that it's right now it's a fraction of their cases are online hate crimes cases. I think under 15%. But of course, that's just what they've been able to uncover and open. So I'm wondering, maybe Kanika, you could speak to how well they're equipped. And this is leading up to a question about Bill C-36.
The thing with online hate, and it's quite. I don't think that as some police have indicated that they don't have the tools or mechanisms to identify how much online hate is how persistent it is. However, the fear is that it can potentially lead to severe consequences that comes off online, as we've seen with a number of individuals who have engaged in egregious hate crimes against particular communities. We see a lot of that can be found within their online attendance, their online exchanges. So I think identifying that online hate is detrimental and is a form of hate that should be taken seriously is important. Therefore, with Bill C-26 and indicating that online hate will be identified as potentially as a form of hate crime, I think is quite important. Because the two very much, the physical acts of hate certainly have found, the foundation of it has been found with online. So I think it is quite important that we are now identifying the harms that online hate can have and how that can eventually lead to more severe consequences.
Okay, so you're supportive of the proposed legislation. Anthony, maybe you could follow up before audience questions with your thoughts on C-36 and the efforts to target online hate?
Yeah, I mean, I think as comprehensive as possible to engage with every platform available and every remedy available to do so. I did want to mention, though, if I could pivot to, there's a bill, I think we want an NDP member, I think it's Peter, C-229, who is wanting to, in a sense, respond to what happened in terms of the convoy, and to say that there should be a criminalization, so to speak, of the Confederate flag, Nazi symbols, and so forth. There's nothing available to address those things in any meaningful, comprehensive way. And I think that, so we have to be adaptive. We have to find ways in order to respond to the realities that are there and not those that we're trying to fix before. I mean, I think you can do both.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, it's in reporting on a spree of murders in northern BC a couple years ago. I was struck by the regalia that the suspects had, and I found where they bought it, and there's a trade in not just like the memorabilia that's actually got historical value, per se. These are knockoffs, replicas that are sold openly. So I take your points and I appreciate them. Are there any audience questions? I saw one hand go up there.
Excuse me.
Mr. Kerr, I think. No?
Oh. We have a few over here from the audience.
Oh, okay.
We're just taking them in. The first one is, how do you do restorative justice on a larger scale? What would it take?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think when you say larger scale, I would say it is something that more communities and persons and groups should take up. I don't think it's something you can do large scale because there's something very personal about it. Now you can teach the principles, those are important, but in terms of finding effective transformation, there needs to be a relationship that is a journey. As I mentioned, we took 3 years to do this because it doesn't happen quickly. And I think trying to do it on a mass scale is just performative.
Does that not come with the commitment from Crown to have specialists
Exactly.
Were you working with Moise Karimji? I mean, he's gained a bit of fame interrogating the convoy.
Yes, and he was
organizers.
actually the one who was prosecuting the young man and so forth. And so I've had a long relationship with him, and most recently, as I mentioned, I'm working with those that he has identified who are disposed to find some success in the restorative opportunities, and been able to bring sort of perpetrator and victim together.
But again, that's so central, that relationship, and that can only come about when you have someone in power who's there for, you know, a long tenure. And too often with police, I think people are shuffled in and out of these files, and just as they gain the experience, that, you know, they don't have that opportunity. So I wonder if systemically you can kind of maybe have terms. I don't. Do you see any solutions there?
That's a great question. And I think that, you know, enhancing community engagement should be ingrained within policing in its entirety. It's the issue at hand often is you might have a very progressive officer in a role who believes very much in building positive relations with the community, and then someone else takes that role, and all the gains that have been made are then dismantled. Therefore, it's quite important to start from the very beginning, stressing the importance of building meaningful relationships with racialized communities, ethnic communities, religious communities, in order if policing is to represent public safety and those to turn to when in need, there has to be a level of understanding of what those community needs are. Therefore, it is something that needs to be instilled right from the beginning, as opposed to it being placed on just a particular role within the service. There needs to be a nuanced, a nuanced way of making to ensure that is part of the entire culture, as opposed to within specific units.
I think if your hate crimes unit or even your branch of the prosecution service is one person, then succession is always going to be an issue.
Yeah, and I think one of the ways in which, just to follow up what you were saying, is that an enhanced neighborhood police presence. You know, I really think that the presence in the community, getting to know relationships and so forth is significant and necessary, because there is a lot of mistrust in racialized communities and other communities, religious communities around police and so forth. And so one of the ways in which to bridge that is to demonstrate an authenticity and a commitment to be a part of community life in ways that are what I would call filled with humility and listening, as well as relationships. So I don't think we can get very far unless we use a multi-pronged approach, and that's a significant one.
One more.
What's the difference between police and human rights commissions fighting hate? Why can't hate be criminalized?
Kanika, I think.
May I hear that question again?
Sure. What's the difference between police and human rights commissions fighting hate? Why can't hate be criminalized?
That's a great question, and I think that's probably why we are looking to have a standalone offense that will allow for. I'm hesitant to use the word criminalization, as it's more in order to have those who experience hate to be validated and to know that there is a mechanism in dealing with that. So I think that's why it's important to have a standalone offense for police to refer to. And certainly human rights commissions as well should continue to be involved in the process, because they very much are addressing experiences of human rights. And it is important for police and human rights commissions to work together. It's if we do have a standalone offense that specifically addresses with hate, that will start to build a better response and mechanism and ways to address and validate those who have experienced hate.
I agree.
Okay, well, I think that's about our time. Thank you so much, Anthony and Kanika, and everyone else for the questions.
Thank you. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you.
Hello. My name is Tom Cardoso. I'm a reporter with the Globe and Mail. First of all, I wanted to thank Mike for that great panel. Thank you so much, Mike. Another round of applause, if you don't mind. I should probably take off my mask, too. Still hard to get used to that. I'm pleased to be here today to moderate our next two discussions. Both are going to be focused on online hate. First up, I have Carla Beauvais, a columnist and social entrepreneur in Montreal. Carla is going to talk to us about her own personal experience with online hate. I think we're going to try it in English, but worst case, we will switch to French and we'll have live translation. So thank you so much. Hello. Thank you for joining us, Carla.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Sorry, I have so many pieces of paper. So can you just tell us a little bit about your experience with online hate? I don't know much about it myself. Can you just tell us about what happened?
It happened in 2020, almost 2 years ago, after George Floyd. In Montreal, I used to write for a journal called Métro. So I was a columnist there, regularly talking about topics about social injustice, more about the Black community. And after George Floyd, me and some friends, we decided to create an app to unify Black businesses in Montreal and Quebec, and just so people can support them. And after that, after we launched it, we had an article on the Gazette, and two columnists from a media that I won't share the name, they wrote like a piece of paper about what we were doing, how we were trying to divide Quebec, how racist this app was, and it's a big media in Quebec. And then after, I made a mistake because I tried to explain them on their Facebook page what really was about what we were trying to do. And then after that, I think it just opened the door for me receiving all kind of messages from people that were following them. It was crazy. But so far in Facebook, I'm not really into Facebook, so I didn't really look at all the comments. I had some of them, and then I was like, okay, that's enough. And then it was in my DM. Again, I could have just I shut down my internet. But then after that, I started receiving calls at home. And this is when it was, for me, and I said, Dr. Bailey said it right, because it's not staying online. For me, I think I was capable to control when it was only online, but then receiving calls at my house, I'm a single mother, people were giving me my address, saying that they were coming at my place, killing me, stuff like that. So it was crazy. For a couple of weeks, I never stepped outside the house. I stayed there almost a month without going out. And I don't know if they were just trying to scare me, but for me, it was very, very difficult. After that, I stopped everything, stopped going online. I stopped writing my column in the Métro. I was really scared. And my life changed completely after that. Every time I thought about it, I'm getting emotional.
Yeah, no, I can tell. Obviously, it would make you emotional. Of course, it's interesting how every time you thought that you would address the problem by shutting down a certain, social outlet, saying, "Okay, I won't post here anymore," or "I'm going to ignore this place," they would find a new place to they would find you basically and came to your home effectively,
Exactly.
right? That I can't imagine how difficult that must have been.
And you have to think, because I'm like, okay, that person really take the time to search for my address. Like to tell me, like, I know where you live, this is your address, and I'm gonna come. And like, I was like, this is crazy. And it wasn't only one person, I got several different calls.
Yeah, when it becomes personal like that, obviously it was always personal, but when it comes to your household, I'm sure that takes on a completely different quality, right? I mean, it's just the impact you must feel it to this day, I would imagine. Right?
Exactly, but like, am I gonna stay there? I'm gonna move. Is my daughter is in danger? It's all kind of stuff, and I'm like, it's crazy because people. Sometimes I hear stuff, and I'm like, people just write stuff online, and they don't really think about the effect, how it's gonna destroy life, or how like mentally it can be very like a burden for people.
Yeah, I mean, here we are talking about it a year and a half later, and clearly it's still very raw, as it understandably would be. So maybe we can shift a little bit to talking about, some of the work that you've done since. You participated in an anti-hate campaign with the Canadian Race Relations Foundation and the YWCA. Can you tell us a little bit about the role of, public education and awareness? I mean, obviously everyone has covered it today already, but we're going to keep talking about it. So.
And I have to say, before doing that campaign, 8 months after that happened, I wrote a piece on Quebec, and it was the first time talking about it publicly. My close friends were aware, but nobody like really knew what happened to me. And then I wrote that piece where I didn't mention the name of the journalist, but I really went into how they affect me, what they wrote. Like maybe they did it through like clickbaits or whatever the reason why they're trying to do that. But I really went and explained how it affects me as a woman, as a single mom. So I really went down. And then I had the opportunity to talk to one of the journalists. Didn't do anything, like it was really, didn't help really, but for me it was important for me to have that conversation with him and for him to understand. So after that article, I got the call from the foundation, and I have to say thanks to Mohamed Hashim, because I didn't want to talk about it publicly on cam. So it was the first time for me, like really doing it, and the response, at first I wasn't really sure. The director was one of my friends, so I think that's really why I said yes. Will Prosper is the one that showed it, so I think I was kind of, I feel secure with him. But the impact after that, like people were writing me and telling me how courageous I was, that they were not aware about what happened to me, but also other people that face those kind of events and they don't know where to turn, what to do. Because one thing I regret is I didn't press charge. I never went to the police. I didn't do anything. I kept everything for myself. And that campaign really helped because people were able to read the kind of messages I received because I kept all the messages, and I shared some of the lines that I received, like the N-word, like go back to your country, like we want to kill you, stuff like that. So people were reading those messages out loud, and they had to like express themselves about that. So I think it really opened the eyes of a lot of people about the negative impact of like those kind of hate. And it's when Dr. Bailey said it's non-violent, I really agree with him, because it's harder than a punch in the face when you have to live with this inside of you. And sometimes people don't really understand why it's affecting you. You know, it's just online, just stupid people telling stupid stuff, but it goes way, way deeper than that.
Oh, no, of course. And, you know, it's interesting you mentioning that when you started to talk about this, you had this groundswell of support, because it does seem to be there is this insidious nature to, you know, hate speech and online hate, especially where you end up suffering in silence, right? And you're experiencing all this stuff alone, and you can't talk to anyone because, for one thing, it's just very hard to talk about, but it's also scary, right? And then, of course, once you start talking about it, there is all this support, but it's impossible to get that when you're in that moment.
Exactly. And I think we need to talk, like events like that, it's very important. And like we have to still push with the government to have bills to protect the community, because it's very important. And talking about it, like awareness, it's very important. And when I was listening to Dr. Bailey, and I'm like, when he was saying like that the restorative program that he did with that person, I was like, oh my God, I wish I could have that. I'm Christian too, but I'm not sure I would have been able to do that. So, so I was like, oh my God, like we need to talk about it, and we need to find spaces when we can feel like secure to talk about those topics.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly time. So thank you so much, Carla. Thank you for coming and sharing your story.
And my English wasn't so
Oh,
bad.
it was wonderful. It was great. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Cool. And now I'd just like to build on Carla's insights. We're going to have a panel with Daniel Panitin, manager of online hate research and education project with the Sarah and Chaim Neuberger Holocaust Education Center in Toronto. And Samia Hassan is also joining us, executive director of the Council of Agencies Serving South Asians, also based in Toronto. And we're going to have a chat about solutions and online hate a little bit more broadly, perhaps. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Well, yeah. So, Sammy, I'm going to start with you, if you don't mind. I'm wondering, we've talked to Carla, we've heard from many others today about, examples and specifics about online hate, but I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how this has worked how this has affected the South Asian community, both in Toronto and in Canada generally, and, how has the pandemic affected the volume and type of online hate that you've been seeing?
Thanks so much for that question, Tom. And before I start, I just wanted to thank Carla for her story. I know it's not easy kind of reliving your trauma and talking to people about it. And girl, you didn't do anything wrong by speaking up on social media. I think that's what hate mongers are trying to get us to do, right? To silence women like me, women like Carla, and not really tell our story. So good for you for coming out here today and sharing that. In terms of the South Asian community, so the anti-hate work that we do at CASA is actually broader than the South Asian communities. So we work in partnership with a group called the Anti-Hate Community Leaders Group. And with that group, we actually have built a coalition that is inclusive of communities wider than South Asian. So we have individuals and community representatives from the Black community, the Indigenous community, the Jewish community, the Muslim community, the Hispanic community, and the Asian community. And we've seen across the board, amongst all of these communities, an increase in hate crime, whether it's online or whether it's in person. All communities are experiencing it. And the way that online hate is, that we're seeing it now, and I believe somebody has mentioned this already, everybody is at home, or was at home. I'm glad that today we're here in person. And we're online, and we have this kind of screen in front of us, and it allows us to be anonymous. And that has led people to kind of speak whatever they want without having consequences attached to it. And that's what we've been seeing. So there's a lot of different forms of hate, whether it's doxing, whether it's disinformation or misinformation or defamation. We've seen all of it in all of our communities. And it's been very difficult to not only to have to deal with the pandemic and the loss, the health of our loved ones, and within the South Asian communities, there is a large portion of the South Asian community that are immigrants. So we're dealing with not just the pandemic here, but also pandemic back home and loss there, not being able to travel. So it's been very difficult and dealing with in-person and online across the board.
Yeah. Well, let's maybe build on that, Daniel. Maybe your work is often requiring you to track online hate in its many forms, right? Can you tell us a little bit about how prevalent it is today in your experience? I mean, obviously, we know from Samia and others that it is quite prevalent, but can you just give us some kind of context? How does it look compared to 5 or 10 years ago?
Well, we've definitely during the pandemic seen a real explosion of hate content being posted online and in-person hate incidents. And to absolutely build on your point about people were spending a lot more time at home, one thing that I wanted to drive home was that people were isolated, they were alienated, and they were scared. And that, unfortunately, drives people to look for answers and to look for outlets. And unfortunately, people were starting to buy into more bigoted arguments about what was happening with the COVID pandemic. They're buying into conspiracy theories, which then motivated targeting specific communities, particularly the Asian community and the Jewish communities. So, for example, one of the websites that we keep an eye on is the infamous 4chan. We do see explosions of postings of anti-Semitic, of hateful materials that correlate directly to incidents. So typically, say on 4chan, you'd see a couple of Canada posts a week. But when the convoy happened in Ottawa, what was a trickle turned into an absolute fire hose. And we didn't have actually the manpower to document the amount of hatred that we were looking at. And that was just one form of hate. Online hate can be memes. Online hate can be an emoji sent to someone. Online hate can be the inbox of a journalist, particularly a journalist who is a woman, particularly a journalist who's a woman of color. I'll wrap up saying absolutely there's been an explosion of both targeted hatred and generalized bigotries.
Mm-hmm. You were noticing this even before the pandemic though as well?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely the election in 2016 in the United States certainly gave a lot of people carte blanche to express what was once unacceptable to express in public sentiments. And the pandemic has only accelerated a radicalizing process that we'd been seeing happen for a number of years. Yeah.
So Samia, maybe I can jump back to you if you don't mind. I'm kind of curious, do you and your colleagues report online hate when you see it? How to the authorities, and how have they responded?
So we heard a lot about the reporting process earlier today, so I won't go into detail about that, but I can just say it's a very difficult process, even for people that do this work on an everyday basis. We actually personally had an incident of a Zoom bombing. I know we're talking about social media, but we forget about, now that we're on Zoom, and recently there's been a lot of news about people infiltrating Zoom rooms and using racial slurs, pornography. We personally had that experience where we had a South Asian Heritage Month event and 2 people entered our Zoom room and shared pornography and were using racial slurs against the young moderator that we had, which is a staff of mine. We did take that on to report it to the police, and the experience we had was very, very difficult. We were kind of bounced around from one person to another person. It also depends on police units. Going back to the discussion we had earlier with the representatives from the different police units, but the unit that we were reporting to, they didn't have a hate crime unit. At the end of the day, the case closed because it was a person that they couldn't identify. It was a person that came into the room with a fake email address. So how do you report that, and what goes on after that? So that person is probably doing it more and more to other organizations, to other people doing social justice work, and it's difficult to report. So that's just an online space. In offline spaces too, I think we were talking about reporting, and that's very difficult, and for many reasons people don't report it. And people shared statistics this morning, earlier this afternoon. Our colleagues at the Canadian Anti-Hate Network also shared some statistics that less than 1% are actually reported to the police in terms of hate crimes. And there's various reasons for why that is, but why is it so difficult, right, for people to report? And when they do report, people find that there's no benefit to reporting, right? Mm-hmm. So when people are reporting, and we talked a lot about the criminal code and that bar that they have to meet to actually convict somebody of a hate crime. So the police, what we have in conversation with the police, we've learned that they just charge them with assault as opposed to a hate crime, because that's easier to convict somebody with an assault as opposed to a hate crime. So there's so many different reasons why offline hate and online hate is so difficult to report.
So it's interesting that you're talking about this discrepancy, because it does strike me that there's a big chasm between online hate and hate crime as definitions, right? And we've heard a lot, especially in the previous panel, about those definitions with the criminal codes, can and can't do, allows people, the authorities to do. But it almost feels odd to talk about online hate in the context of crime sometimes, given, again, the huge difference between the narrow criminal definition and what people are actually experiencing. So I suppose this would be a question for the both of you. How has this discrepancy affected the communities that you help and support?
Well, I think it's definitely created a situation that has led to the underreporting, because people are scared that they won't have what is a crime that was committed against them taken seriously by the authorities, and that's definitely a theme that's been borne out today. I think a lot of it emerges from the kind of culture that emerged in early internet and early social media websites, particularly websites like Reddit, were constructed by cisgender straight white men who did not themselves experience that kind of behavior online. And so they were raised in a sort of total free speech, anarchic ethos where anything goes. And these websites have gotten better in recent years as people have been able to prove that this kind of behavior is happening. But a lot of it has to do with basically the people who created the platforms didn't take it seriously and did not recognize that there was a direct link between things being posted and real life occurrences happening.
It strikes me that, you know, the nature of the way that we police this, or perhaps more accurately don't police this right now, is that we're downloading these responsibilities onto the people actually experiencing it. So we're asking them to be responsible for, you know, responding to it, not escalating, right, and reporting it to the authorities and everything else. Samia, has that been your experience?
I think that's a very good point, and that kind of brings us to talk about the role of the social media, which is the title of this panel. I think we really downplay that role of social media. So what is their role in taking down hate content? I mean, they're earning millions of dollars through advertises and you know, exploitation of different communities. So why are we not holding them responsible for making their spaces safer? If they are there for the users, they should support the users in making their spaces safer. And you know, I've seen a lot of research, and I've talked to a lot of people that have created programs which can take down hate content. So they've used algorithms within the system to take down hate content. And social media internally has its own algorithms where they actually match, if you're looking for a hate content, they will match you with other hate content. So if you're looking for something anti-Semitic, they will match you with some groups that are Islamophobic. They will match you with misogynist content. So if they can do that, they can feed that into your system. Why can they not do the reverse of that, take that hate content before it is even posted? So I think there's a huge role for social media to play, and we don't talk about that enough, and I think regulators need to hold social media accountable for that.
Daniel, what do you think about that? You're experiencing, well, you're cataloging this stuff, you're collecting it, you're seeing all the different, you know, heads of this beast as they pop up over time. Mm-hmm. How do you feel, what do you think about the idea of regulating social media, especially on the, perhaps regulating is not the right word, I don't know. What do you think about social media's responsibility in all of this?
Well, social media definitely plays a very responsible role, but I think one thing we need to recognize is that we're almost moving beyond the era of kind of centralized social media outlets like Facebook, Twitter, Reddit that everyone is using. And there's really an ecosystem of alternative media outlets that are growing very rapidly. And so the concern is not so much the hate content that is appearing, say, on Facebook, but it's the link that gets posted on Facebook that then takes the user to some blog or something, and that's where they're starting to really view the extreme content. And unfortunately, studies have shown that Facebook is terrible about addressing outlinking. They've gotten much better about addressing certain things, so not great about other things like Holocaust denial, but when it comes to outlinking, that's a real problem that they have not addressed, and that as these alternative media networks continue to grow is probably going to become increasingly an issue.
So let's just stick with that for a moment, because I think you're both touching on something interesting there. There's been a lot of talk in the last couple of years about the rabbit hole effect that social media generates, right? The idea that if you're on YouTube and you watch a video about, you know, 9/11 and, you know, what happened there or whatever, you might have, like 5 videos later, you're now watching white supremacist content because of the way that the algorithm has pushed you towards that. What do you both think about, you know, this idea that there is a pipeline that takes a regular person and, you know, effectively radicalizes them through the media that they're being exposed to intentionally by the social media platforms?
Do you want to take that, or?
Yeah, sure, I can start on that. I think that's the recognition that social media companies have to make, that it's not just online, and we heard from Carla that it will extend offline, and it will extend to real life consequences. So the actions that they have to take have to be urgent, and people's lives depend on it, right? So that radicalization piece happens, and eventually you will do something in real life where it will hurt somebody. And you know, as the Reverend said previously, all those actions, even words, are violent towards the person that is receiving them. So really recognizing that the status quo is not acceptable, and it hurts communities, it's violent to communities, and drastic change has to be made.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Daniel? What do you make of this rabbit hole effect? Are there ways to flip that on its head, perhaps? Things that we could do to kind of address that before those people become radicalized in the first place? Because you look at, January 6th insurrection, all those people met online.
Mm-hmm. So the rabbit hole is definitely a factor, and the algorithm plays a role in that. And we know that Facebook specifically, their algorithm was actually designed to show you content that was going to make you angry first, because we know that anger-inducing content spreads farther and faster, and people click it more often. And that is in their best interest for you to do that. And that principle is very applicable to things like TikTok and YouTube, where it's in their best interest to have you just continually watching. So they're going to feed you something a little more extreme each time. With sort of anodyne interests, it's not a problem. So if you're into like baking or gardening, the algorithm's actually pretty great. But if you start getting involved with politics, then you might be suggesting someone a little more extreme, and then the radicalization can happen.
Yeah. So I guess to pivot towards the solutions question for you guys, what do we do about social platforms that have these algorithms that are pushing for this stuff, and that are perhaps becoming fragmented, and where we don't have the ability to monitor this speech in the same way? Maybe we can talk about the algorithm side first. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So when we look at a website like, or how social media companies approach something like Holocaust denial, we saw that when they actually started trying to automate the removal of Holocaust denial, what they ended up removing was actually Holocaust education content. They'd see a photograph on the Auschwitz Museum's Facebook page, and it's gone. And then the denial material itself remained. So there needs to be sort of interventions there, and this is very expensive because you basically need to have in-house experts who both know the content, but also know how this subject is evolving in social media ecosystems. When it comes to, like, say, intervening, so let's say we have Holocaust denial on Facebook, and they post, okay, here's actually a link to Yad Vashem or the USHMM or a real institution so you can get some real information. Will that work? We saw that happen with COVID misinformation and disinformation on Instagram and Facebook, and it's up for debate how effective that actually was in preventing someone's radicalization.
Yeah. So, Samuel, let's talk about moderation for a second. We've talked about, the algorithms and whatnot, but when it comes to a human being trying to intervene and, catch this rhetoric before it occurs, this like online hate, especially on social media, of course, what do you think, how should we be approaching that? Because clearly the solution right now isn't working, based on everything you're experiencing.
Mm-hmm. So I think what we in our policy nerd circles call it is a wicked problem, and a wicked problem needs multiple solutions. And the algorithms are just one part of it. And I don't think it's possible for a human being to monitor and take down the hate content. We've tried to do it as an organization. So recently we launched a campaign called the Eradicate Hate campaign, where we debunked a lot of myths about racialized communities, about Indigenous communities, about faith minority communities, and the hate we received in return was mind-boggling. And I had 5 staff of mine and myself trying to monitor and take that hate content down and to report it. And it was just so difficult for us and our mental health just to even read those comments. And I empathize with Carla for having to read those comments. So I don't think it's a human effort that is responsible for monitoring and taking it down. I think there are systems that could be built and put in place to do the monitoring and taking it down. I think regulation is definitely part of it. I think capacity building is also part of it, and we often don't talk about that. The communities that are being targeted, because there will never be zero hate content online. So we can get that established, but we can significantly reduce it. But some people are still going to experience it. So building their capacity to combat it, to respond to it, and to do it in a safe way, and to take care of their mental health while they're doing it. So I think that is one piece that we're missing. And again, a shameless plug here for our Eradicate Hate campaign. We recently launched a toolkit which has education, which has action that you can take, which has capacity building resources, and it tells you digital security methods that you can take to keep yourself secure. So I think that aspect is so important, along with the whole host of solutions that we just talked about.
Yeah, I realize that we're coming short on time, so I'd like to open it up for a question or two, if we have any. Yeah, I see a hand there. I feel like we might have time for one question, so we'll see.
I was told not to turn my head.
Can someone please explain when Bill C-10 came into place, particularly in regards to the regulation of social media about spreading hate propaganda? This one came in from online.
Is that something you guys?
I don't feel qualified to speak to that.
Is it Bill C-10 or Bill C-36? Because Bill C-36 has not yet passed.
Maybe they meant Bill C-36. Can you speak to that?
So that is a bill that is proposed by the federal government. I believe that there is going to be a lot of consultations on it. It's not yet passed. There's new definitions of what hate is in that bill, and it uses language like emotions, vilification, and things that are stronger than dislike and disdain. There's a lot of other regulations to it too, like bringing back Section 13. But I can't speak more to it because I'm not part of the federal government and I'm not sure when it's going to be passed. But that's just a bill that's in place right now. And there will be consultations on it as far as I know.
Thank you. And that's a perfect segue to the next set of talks, which will be about with members of the federal government. So there you go. Thank you so much, everyone. Give them a round of applause, please. Daniel and Samia. Thanks so much. I would now like to hand it off to my colleague, Dakshana Bhaskaramurthy, who is going to moderate the next panel.